Good morning guys, welcome back to story time. Today we are going to read chapter 3 part 2. Let me just quickly remind you what we read on the previous video. So Ron, Fred and George, Ron's brothers, went to help Harry escape in a flying car. They're flying over the country and have nearly landed home. This was the arrived home. This was the last picture I showed you of them flying, and yeah, let's continue. The last sentence was, they had landed next to a tumble down garage in a small yard, and Harry looked out for the first time at Ron's house. Okay, so let's read on. It looked as though it had once been a large stone pigsty, but extra rooms had been added here and there until it was several stories high, and so crooked it looked as though it was held up by magic, which Harry reminded himself it probably was. 4 or 5 chimneys were perched on top of the red roof. A lopsided sign stuck in the ground near the entrance read "The Burrow." Round the front door lay a jumble of Wellington boots and a very rusty cauldron. Several fat brown chickens were pecking their way around the yard. "It's not much," said Ron. "It's brilliant," said Harry happily, thinking of Privet Drive. They got out of the car. "Now we'll go upstairs really quietly," said Fred, "and wait for Mum to call us for breakfast. Then Ron, you come bounding downstairs going, Mum, look who turned up in the night, and she'll be all pleased to see Harry, and no one needs to ever know we flew the car." "Right," said Ron. "Come on, Harry. I sleep at the—" Ron had gone a nasty greenish colour, his eyes fixed on the house. The other 3 wheeled around. Mrs. Weasley was marching across the yard, scattering chickens, and for a short, plump, kind-faced woman, it was remarkable how much she looked like a saber-toothed tiger. "Ah," said Fred. "Oh dear," said George. Mrs. Weasley came to a halt in front of them, her hands on her hips, staring from one guilty face to the next. She was wearing a flowered apron with a wand sticking out of her pocket. "So," she said. "Morning, Mum," said George in what he clearly thought was a jaunty, winning voice. "Have you any idea how worried I've been?" said Mrs. Weasley in a deadly whisper. "Sorry, Mum, but see, we had to—" All 3 of Mrs. Weasley's boys were taller than she was, but they cowered as her rage broke over them. "Bed's empty, no note, car gone, could have crashed. Out of my mind with worry. Did you care? Never as long as I've lived. You wait until your father gets home. We never had trouble like this from Bill or Charlie or Percy." "Perfect, Percy," muttered Fred. "You could do with taking a leaf out of Percy's book," yelled Mrs. Weasley, prodding a finger in Fred's chest. "You could have died. Could have been seen. You could have lost your father's job." It seemed to go on for hours. Mrs. Weasley had shouted herself hoarse before she turned on Harry, who backed away. "I'm very pleased to see you, Harry dear," she said. "Come in and have some breakfast." She turned and walked back into the house, and Harry, after a nervous glance at Ron, who nodded encouragingly, followed her. The kitchen was small and rather cramped. There was a scrubbed wooden table and chairs in the middle, and Harry sat down on the edge of his seat, looking around. He had never been in a wizard house before. The clock on the wall opposite him had only 1 hand and no numbers at all. Written around the edge were things like "Time to make tea," "Time to feed the chickens," and "You're late." Books were stacked 3 deep on the mantelpiece, books with titles like "Charm Your Own Cheese," "Enchantment in Baking," and "1 Minute Feasts It's Magic." And unless Harry's ears were deceiving him, the old radio next to the sink had just announced that coming up was Witching Hour with the popular singing sorceress Celestina Warbeck. Mrs. Weasley was clattering around cooking breakfast, a little haphazardly, throwing dirty looks at her sons as she threw sausages into the frying pan. Every now and then she muttered things like, "Don't know what you were thinking of," and "never would have believed it." "I don't blame you, dear," she assured Harry, tipping 8 or 9 sausages onto his plate. "Arthur and I have been worried about you too. Just last night we were saying we'd come and get you ourselves if you hadn't written back to Ron by Friday." But really, she was now adding 3 fried eggs to his plate, flying an illegal car halfway across the country. Anyone could have seen you. She flicked her wand casually at the washing up in the sink, which began to clean itself, clinking gently in the background. "It was cloudy, Mum," said Fred. "You keep your mouth closed while you're eating," Mrs. Weasley snapped. "They were starving him, Mum," said George. "And you," said Mrs. Weasley, but it was a slightly softened expression that she started cutting Harry bread and buttering it for him. At that moment there was a diversion in the form of a small red-headed figure in a long nightdress, who appeared in the kitchen, gave a small squeal, and ran out again. "Ginny," said Ron in an undertone to Harry, "my sister. She's been talking about you all summer." "Yeah, she'll be wanting your autograph, Harry," grinned Fred, but he caught his mother's eyes and bent his face over his plate without another word. Nothing more was said until all 4 plates were clean, which took a surprisingly short time. "Blimey, I'm tired," yawned Fred, setting down his knife and fork at last. "I think I'll go to bed and—" "You will not," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "It's your own fault. You've been up all night. You're going to de-gnome the garden for me. They're going completely out of hand again." "Oh, Mum, and you too," she said, glaring at Ron and George. "You can go up to bed, dear," she added to Harry. "You didn't ask them to fly the wretched car." But Harry, who felt wide awake, said quickly, "I'll help, Ron. I've never seen a de-gnoming." "That's very sweet of you, dear, but it's dull work," said Mrs. Weasley. "Now let's see what Lockhart's got to say on the subject." And she pulled a heavy book from the stack on the mantelpiece. George groaned. "Mum, we know how to de-gnome a garden." Harry looked at the cover of Mrs. Weasley's book. Right across it, fancy gold letters, were the words, "Gilderoy Lockhart's Guide to Household Pests." There was a big photograph on the front of a very good-looking wizard with wavy blonde hair and bright blue eyes. As always in the wizarding world, the photograph was moving. The wizard, who Harry supposed was Gilderoy Lockhart, kept winking cheekily up at them all. Mrs. Weasley beamed down at him. "Oh, he is marvellous," she said. "He knows his household pests all right. It's a wonderful book." "Mum fancies him," said Fred, in a very audible whisper. "Don't be so ridiculous, Fred," said Mrs. Weasley, her cheeks rather pink. "All right, if you think you know better than Lockhart, you can go and get on with it, and woe betide you if there's a single gnome in that garden when I come out to inspect it." Yawning and grumbling, the Weasleys slouched outside with Harry behind them. The garden was large in Harry's eyes, exactly what a garden should be. The Dursleys wouldn't have liked it. There were plenty of weeds and the grass needed cutting, but there were gnarled trees all around the walls, plants Harry had never seen spilling from every flower bed, and a green pond full of frogs. "Muggles have garden gnomes too, you know," Harry told Ron as they crossed the lawn. "Yeah, I've seen these things. Yeah, I've seen those things they think are gnomes," said Ron, bent double with his head in a peony bush, "like fat little Father Christmases with fishing rods." There was a violent scuffling noise. The peony bush shuddered, and Ron straight ended up. "This is a gnome," he said grimly. "Get off me! Get off me!" squealed the gnome. It was certainly nothing like Father Christmas. It was small and leathery looking, with a large, knobbly, bald head, exactly like a potato. Ron held its arm Ron held it at arm's length as it kicked out at him with its horny little feet. He grasped it around the ankles and turned it upside down. This is what you have to do, he said. He raised the gnome above his head. Get off me! And started to swing it in great circles like a lasso. Seeing its shocked look on Harry's face, Ron added, It doesn't hurt them. You've just got to make them really, really dizzy so they can't find their way back to the gnome holes. He let go of the gnome's ankle. It flew 20 feet into the air and landed with a thud in the field over the hedge. Pitiful, said Fred. I bet I can get mine beyond the stump. Harry learned quickly not to feel too sorry for the gnomes. He decided just to drop the first one he caught over the hedge. But the gnome, sensing weakness, sank its razor-sharp teeth into Harry's finger, and he had a hard job shaking it off until... Wow, Harry, that must have been 50 feet! The air was soon thick with flying gnomes. See, they're not too bright, said George, seizing 5 or 6 gnomes at a time. The moment they know the denoming's going on, they storm up to have a look. They think they'd have learnt by now just to stay put. Soon, the crowd of gnomes in the field started walking away in a straggling line, their little shoulders hunched. They'll be back, said Ron as they watched the gnomes disappear into the hedge on the other side of the field. They love it here. Dad's too soft with them. He thinks they're funny.